This morning I'm standing at the Yellow River here in Newton County. The Yellow River flows into the Ocmulgee, which flows into the Altamaha, which then flows down near Darien, Georgia, into the Atlantic Ocean. I've grown up by the Yellow River, and it's always kind of held a special place in my heart. So any chance I can get to get by it or get in it, I love to do. If you've ever read Life on a Georgia Plantation, these waters ultimately then flow by the Butler Plantation, which is where Fanny Butler lived. The house that Fanny Butler lived in is still standing. If you want to visit that house, get a fishing license because it's on a wildlife management area and you need a fishing license to visit it. But in that book, it talks about how she would stand on the back porch and talk to the enslaved people. And that porch is still there, so you can go stand on that porch and kind of have a head full of history there. Today, we're going to go check out Oxford Cemetery, which is near Emory College, or now Oxford College, part of Emory University. And I've done a little bit of research on it, and first we're gonna go check out the church. Real quickly though, one cool thing, Georgia just had a lot of rains recently, and I'm standing on a natural levee. And granted, there's a lot of trash and it's dirty, but when these waters overflow the riverbanks, they'll deposit a bunch of sediments all through here. And this was probably running with water. You can kind of see that there used to be water running through here not that long ago. And all this sand here was deposited by the river. It kind of smells a little bit. Nonetheless, kind of a cool feature to see here in the building of these rivers and the riverbanks. This is Old Emory Church here in Oxford, Georgia. This area is rich with history, and I've studied up some of the books. And there's a lot more history than I care to attempt to tackle, but a couple things of note. So the Methodist movement was founded by John Wesley, and we are standing here. This road right here is Wesley Road, or Street, Wesley Street, right there. All the names of the roads here in Oxford are named for famous people, or whatever you want to call it, in Methodism. John Wesley, you can see a statue of him in downtown Savannah, was the founder of Methodism or something like that. I don't know. Back in the 1800s, the Methodist movement wanted to create a college, and so they came to a spot in the woods here on the north side of Covington and founded a little town called Oxford, which is named for John Wesley's alma mater, or where he went to college over in England at Oxford University. And Emory is named for some other famous guy in Methodism. But this was their big church here. I'm really screwing the history up, but look at the moon. But you know, I'm not perfect. I'm not trying to speak on authority on the history. One thing that's really interesting, if you notice, the church had two doors. They had a left and a right door at the front, and they also have it in there. And the church is divided, and it's because the men sat on the left side and the women sat on the right side. Here are those two doors that you can see. You'll see churches like this that have those two doors, and it's because the congregation used to be split. Anyway, we're going around the back of the church here because one of the interesting things that we'll find in Oxford Cemetery is the grave of the woman. She's got her full name, but in all the history books she's known as Miss Kitty, who was an enslaved person that was inherited by Bishop James Andrew. And this building here on the back side of the church, this was her cottage. And if you just didn't know what this was, there's no plaques or anything. You kind of have to read the history books to know about this. Anyway, as the story goes, Miss Kitty was inherited by the bishop, and it caused a rift in the Methodist movement and led to things like the Methodist church splitting for almost a century into the north and the south. And now this cottage just kind of sits back here. Knowing the legacy of the church nowadays, how prestigious Emory University is, I'm not surprised they try to keep a low profile on some of this history, which is a shame because it's interesting and fascinating history. Saw an old picture. This monument here, this church was not reconstructed. It was renovated a couple times over the years, and that sign used to be up here in the front of the church. I've seen a couple old pictures where that big sign used to be like right there in the front. But anyway, if you see a lot of churches around here, this really is a huge church for the area. So this was kind of a, I don't know if you want to call it a piece de resistance or something like that, but it really is a big church. Anyway, onto the cemetery. So we are now in Oxford Cemetery. In an effort to not speak so crudely about the history, or to rather give the history some justice here, I've referenced my notes on how Oxford came to be. There was a Georgia Methodist conference in 1834, and a gentleman by the name of Uncle Allen Turner said that the Georgia Methodists should have a college. There was a manual labor school that was started in Covington, a few miles down this road here that these cars are coming down, in 1835. That manual labor school ran into some money issues, and in 1836 a college town was laid out in the woods near Covington, and they named it Oxford after the alma mater of John Wesley, who was the founder of Methodism. They named the college Emory after Bishop John Emory, who was the presiding officer of the conference, where they said, hey, we should have a college. I guess the head honcho there, they're like, hey, we'll name it after you. And classes first opened at Emory College on September 12th, 1838. So there we go. Now let's check out some of the notable burials. The first one I'm seeing here that I know I've written down just in a random order, which I think is one of the coolest ones here. So one day I'll do a thing on Covington Cemetery where Charlie Elliott's buried. But this stone here is for Bonnell Stone. He was as the stone reads, the father of forestry in Georgia. Bonnell Stone helped create the forestry department of Georgia in 1925, and also led to the creation of Vogel Park, which is now a state park. Also on the Stone family plot is George W. Stone Sr. He was one of the first graduates of Emory College in 1842. In one of the history books I read, it talked about how he was one of the secret benefactors of students and saints of the facility, that he would give people money and kind of be hush-hush about it. And just below George W. Stone Sr. is George W. Stone Jr. On his stone, you can see that it reads, he was totally blind at 6, deaf at 40, lame at 64, and back crippled at 73. And his epitaph reads, his life was a constant disappointment, but he did what he could to inspire hope and courage in others. I read a little bit about this guy, and it talked about how he was maybe blinded by the horns of a goat at 6, that he was a fine singer until he went deaf. And Bishop Candler, who we'll see shortly, said that the first honor of Emory's 1875 class would have gone to George if, quote, 2 good eyes had been in his head. This here is the grave of Warren Candler. You're gonna have to forgive the road noise. I can't constantly wait on cars to stop passing, but Warren Candler was a president of Emory College and also a bishop of the Methodist Church. And you'll see here a relic. You know, it's when the church was split. It was the Methodist Episcopal Church, South. One of his brothers was buried in Decatur Cemetery, who we saw in a previous video of mine. And his other brother, Asa Candler, started the Coca-Cola Company. And Asa Candler's son owned Westview Cemetery for a while. The Candler family is a very notable family here in the Atlanta area. This here is the grave of Ignatius Few, which I think is a really cool name. But this is the guy that led the manual labor school before the founding of Emory College. He was born in the 1700s. Back in the Civil War, Emory College had closed, and the old church was used as a hospital. And there was a skirmish in 1864 near Oxford. And this plot here is the grave of some Federal soldiers that were killed in that skirmish. I believe it's 15 soldiers that are buried here. Some of the books describe this as a mass grave. But if there's 15, I guess maybe they were buried all at once, but this strikes me more as 15 in a row than what I would describe as a mass grave. They're probably all individually buried. I can't remember if I mentioned it or not, but Oxford Cemetery is described as the Westminster Abbey of Methodism, given that there's 3 bishops, 8 college presidents, several deans, and many prominent Methodists buried here. This here is Alexander Means. He was born in 1767. And you can see there's even some fresh roses here. The Means family had a lot to do with Oxford early on, and specifically his son, who's buried right here. Alexander Means and his son Alexander Means Jr. In the walking pamphlet, it talks about how Alexander Means here, this gentleman here, the dad, predicted electricity and predicted its application and use with locomotion and illumination. And his son, Alexander Means Jr., was a prominent figure in Emory College. There's a lot to the Means. I'm not doing it justice. There's a whole section in one of the books I read on the Means family. One thing I was told was that Alexander Means built Orna Villa, which is apparently a haunted house here in Oxford. This is where Isaac Hopkins is buried. He was a president of Emory College. Long story short, he was doing some technical classes at Emory, and Emory considered that blasphemous. And at the time, there was a tech school in Atlanta that was looking for a president, and then he went on to become the first president of Georgia Tech. It's been a minute since I made a video, and I don't know if it's a mix of ADD or in pressure or trying to do it right or something. I don't know, but just want to remind everyone that I'm just a dude, I'm not a historian, and I have no idea what I'm doing. And this is a really, really pretty monument. Look at that. Would you just look at that? 81 here goes up through Walnut Grove and into Loganville. And as a kid, I used to always pass this cemetery, and there's one in Walnut Grove right off the side of 81 on the same side of the highway. And I've always just kind of been drawn to this. This is actually something I've just noticed for the first time. So this is the well house here. And those, I bet you those are cedar logs maybe? That's really cool. Got the well house, map of the cemetery, some barbed wire up here. That's pretty cool. Even the cemetery directory, see all my notes. You can look through, find where someone's buried. I just want to show something here that I keep finding so that I'm just not crazy and just show you how we do things here in the South. Right in the middle of the frame there, Alexander Means. That's Alexander Means Jr. And it's talking about how he was the one to predict that electrical thing. And I've got in my notes here, Dr. Alexander Means, and that's the date of Alexander Means Sr., that's 1767. And that's where it says that he predicted the blah, 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 blah. Nonetheless, we've got a nice little metal plaque here and a current PDF on the web that just shows just how conflicting some of this information can be. A lot of DIY historians. And I guess I'm just another one of them. Yeehaw. It's super worn, but according to one of the cemetery books that I referenced and a better picture on Find a Grave, this is the grave of William Justice Parks. According to one of the books, it talks about how he was raised in the backwoods of Georgia by drunken school teachers, and how he attended Salem, which was an early school outside of Athens. And he is married to Dolly Sumner Lunt Burge Parks, who outlived 2 of her husbands, and inherited a large plantation in 1851, I believe, and lived in that plantation during Sherman's march to the sea. And while Sherman's men ransacked her plantation, they did not burn her house down because she knew Captain Weber of Illinois, who knew her brother, Arrington Lunt, who was an early settler of Chicago, and thus saved the home from being burned. This is the grave of Mary Olivia Rees. I read that she developed a lesion near her nose, which got infected, and then she died at 16 years old. Not even 15, it looks like, from the dates. It says 16 in the books, but you look at the dates there. And this right here is lazy, 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 lazy. It's been rained on too, and it's been a couple days since it rained. Maybe they're too lazy to tamp, because you can already see where that grave is sinking right there. But this is poor practice, in my opinion. This is lazy, and frankly disrespectful to leave the dirt like this. I get mounding the dirt, but to then leave that excess dirt. When you're grave digging and you're filling graves, it is your job to haul that dirt off, because this ain't got nothing to do with Mr. Clifford back here. He doesn't need to have a pile of dirt on his grave. So now all of YouTube gets to see this for years to come. I don't know who filled this grave, but now that's in history. So congrats, you're lazy. This here is Catherine Bird McGath. In the history books, it talks about how she was a spinster and lived and died in Oxford. I'm here on the Burson lot to see the grave of David Wood Burson. He died at 20 years old, or 19 years old. His epitaph reads, "An Eagle Scout." And I read that he was killed by a gunshot wound. And it was described as an accident. And he is the only one buried in this lot that has a marker, I guess. It's a little tiny airplane. He's really low to the ground, too. Pretty cool. This is the grave of another bishop of the Methodist Church buried here. This is James Andrew, or James O. Andrew, and he is the guy that inherited Miss Kitty, the enslaved woman, which is a hell of a way to describe it. And her resting place is right here. Catherine Andrew Boyd, otherwise known as Miss Kitty, who was the woman that lived in that cottage that's now behind the old church. This here is the grave of Reverend Edward Lloyd Thomas. He was a surveyor here in Georgia. He surveyed the city of Columbus, Oxford Cemetery, which we're standing in, as well as Linwood Cemetery down in Columbus. And his son, who died down there, was the first burial in Linwood Cemetery. One thing I noted about this guy that really stuck out to me was his photo on his Wikipedia article is just very wide-eyed. I'll put it up on the screen right now, but it's just fascinating. Some of the photos that you can see when you're doing some research from back in the day. You can tell there's been a lot of preservation work in this cemetery. This is a pretty epitaph. It reads, "How beautiful heaven must be with Nora there." Just to kind of demonstrate some of the prominence of the Means family. This is the grave here of Bryce Gaither. It's a beautiful stone. And while there's also a quote of a bishop, Bishop Pierce, there's a quote here on the back from Alexander Means. "The earth must this beautiful jewel surrender, and luster to beam on Emmanuel's brow. But home where it recently shone in its splendor is dreary and dark in its loneliness now. The casket is broken, but soon in their beauty, there gathered gems shall in brilliancy shine, where eternity's light is the sequence of duty, and gloom shall be lost in the glory divine." And then it's signed A. Means, M.D., D.D. Here's another one of those beautifully carved stones. There's two of them in this cemetery. And this one is for a husband and wife. And the husband was a superintendent at the cotton mills here in Covington. And his wife, Carrie Heyer, died from wounds received in an industrial accident. The accident happened in March, where her hair got caught in machinery and she was scalped, as well as other injuries on her body. And she survived for another 8 months before dying in November of 1904. This is a rarity here. This is the grave of Miss Sammy Nell Fuller. And it has a photo of her deceased. Still bothering me about that grave with all the dirt on it. It's kind of like right in there. And if you're wondering, how lazy are they? So when you've got extra dirt at your grave, you need to put it in a wheelbarrow. And every cemetery is going to have a dirt pile somewhere. And that dirt pile is right here. So we're talking a couple 100-foot walk, and there's some dips in the road to get to it. Or maybe you could load it up in the back of a truck. Nonetheless, leaving it at the gravesite is not the move. The last thing I'd like to find, and I don't know exactly where this gentleman's buried, but somewhere in this cemetery is the man who has the most Purple Hearts. He was awarded 10 Purple Hearts. And I have no idea where he's buried. Whether I find him or not, that'll be the end of the video. The only thing I haven't mentioned is that my grandfather was a Methodist preacher. He preached up near Cleveland, Georgia, and Canton, Georgia, back in the middle of the century. And if you went to Methodist church in those areas, his last name was that of a common piece of furniture found in the living room. I guess one thing we can show here that I haven't filmed it yet, but it's fascinating. Here is the grave here. This is the grave of Maximilian Kendall. And it kind of reminds me of that grave in Decatur Cemetery of that young woman who's kind of buried all to herself. And this is a incredibly ornate iron fencing, and it's quite geometric too, which I think is pretty interesting. This is the grave of Margaret Williams Harrington, and on her grave she was awarded the Carnegie Medal. She saved a boy from drowning to win that medal. I'm sure I've missed plenty of famous people that are buried in here, noteworthy people that are buried in here. This cemetery is rich with history. While there are some pretty stones, I've certainly been to cemeteries with larger and more ornate stones, but the depth and the richness of history in this cemetery is something that's worth a visit if you're ever in the Atlanta area. It's just straight out I-20 eastbound, maybe about 20 miles or so. And you can come visit this cemetery and go to downtown Covington. If you're a fan of vampire TV shows, some of the vampire shows were filmed in downtown Covington. But anyway, there we have it. I'm gonna go get some barbecue. And until next time, just wanted to share my delicious barbecue that I'm rocking here. If you don't ask, y'all make your own stew. Y'all make your own tater salad. You ain't doing it right. And they do. Down here at Southview Cemetery in Covington, and I'm in the kind of very northwest corner. And when I was doing research on Oxford Cemetery, there was one other book that looked like it was by the same publisher, and it was for this little corner of Southview Cemetery. It's its own cemetery, and God, if I don't remember whatever they called it, I think it was some specific church. I don't think it was Methodist, maybe it was, I don't know. Maybe I'll stop by the library and literally walk in there just to reference the name of the book. But this is an older cemetery as well. You can see the old pile of field stones there. Some of the old cedar trees are really pretty through here. And a good place to have lunch. Saved myself a trip to the library. It's Methodist. They're Methodist. This is before Emory. When Covington was the thing, this was where you were buried. Anyway, I'm done now. Okay, bye.